cognitief wetenschapper Hugo Mercier. Hij zit hier ook al ergens tussen, maar we gaan hem straks muten. Hugo Mercier is een vooraanstaand expert op het gebied van menselijke rationaliteit en hij werkt rond de collectieve intelligentie, evolutie en sociale cognitie aan het Institut Nicod in Parijs. Hugo is ervan overtuigd dat wij allemaal niet zo goedgelovig zijn als we zelf denken over elkaar en schreef met zijn boek Not Born Yesterday een provocatief en briljant boek waarin hij dit wijdverspreide beeld op de menselijke natuur ontkracht en dit vanavond dus ook zal voorstellen. Cognitief filosoof Stefaan Blancke is hier ook bij ons en hij gaat met Hugo Mercier in gesprek gaan. Hallo Stefaan en hallo Hugo.
Hallo Jasmine.
Hey, ik laat het woord aan jullie.
Oké, dank u wel. Good evening everyone. Hello Hugo, bonsoir.
Hi Stefan, good evening everyone.
Ça va?
Ça va et toi?
Ça va bien, merci. So Hugo, I've read your excellent book. I have it here with me. I did not read it only once. I read it twice, three times already. So,
so
I know what's in your book. So your main position is, of course, as it's also been announced, is that you think that people are not as gullible as we tend to think. Now, if we look at the news today, it seems that your position is severely challenged, I think. There are lots of conspiracies about COVID being just a cover-up for the radiation of 5G. And also, for instance, that Trump has blind followers who believe everything that Trump says. There are fears about vaccination, especially, of course, in regards to COVID, with the news this week that there is a new vaccine coming up. So, but still, you maintain, so these facts seem to contradict very strongly what you argue for, namely, that we are not as gullible as we tend to think. Now, you think you have good reasons for them, and one of the reasons is an evolutionary reason. So, could you say a little bit about that? So, why is it very unlikely that we would be gullible?
Well, thank you, Stefan. Well, essentially because our ancestors who would have been gullible would not be our ancestors. Very broadly, evolutionarily speaking, we know that for communication to be stable in any system, in any species, it has to benefit both those who send messages and those who receive the messages. So that's kind of well established in the field of the evolution of communication. And the reason behind that is simply that if some of the individuals were to consistently lose either by transmitting signals or by receiving the signals, they would just stop doing so. So what that means then is that given that there are always conflicts of interests between senders and receivers, as long as you're not the cells in a body or something like this, or maybe bees in a beehive, given that there are conflicts of interest, senders have an incentive to mislead and to lie and to manipulate receivers. And that means that the only way for receivers to keep communication mostly beneficial to them is to be skeptical, to be vigilant, to be careful about the information they integrate.
So we tend to be skeptical about the information that we receive because we want to avoid being manipulated or being deceived. And so you call them not skepticism, but you call that open vigilance. So why do you use that term? Why do you call that open vigilance?
So because I want to draw attention to the fact that humans are both vigilant towards communicated information. So we're both able to evaluate what people tell us and to reject information that we don't have good grounds to accept. But we're also open. So we are open to information that challenges our beliefs. And if the information is supported by good arguments or is provided by someone who we can trust, then we can change our minds. And in a way, if we compare human communication to the communication systems of, for instance, other great apes, we find that humans are, mostly more open. It's really hard to convince a chimpanzee to do anything. unless you offer kind of material incentives. And by contrast, humans are much more open to communication. We can talk about anything, and almost, or really all of our decisions are significantly influenced by communication.
Yeah, but in the book you compare it to being an omnivore, so that we are much more open to all kinds of food, you could say. And so the same thing, we are more open to all kinds of information, but that of course brings certain risk. So the risks are here, of course, being manipulated and being deceived. Now, you make it more precise, of course, what you mean with open vigilance, because you say we can have several mechanisms, or we can rely upon several processes in order to make the distinction between reliable information and unreliable information. And so there seems to be several ways that we can do that. And one of the ways is by looking at the content. So you've already mentioned so arguments and looking at probability checking of the information that we get. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yes. So essentially, when half of the mechanisms that we use to evaluate what people tell us, as you were saying, Stefan, deals with the content of the information. So the first thing, and that is something that happens pretty much automatically, whenever you hear something or you read something, you will check whether the content is coherent with what you already believe. So, if you were to tell me that, you were actually in New Zealand, or that, there was a green elephant in your bedroom, my first inclination would be to reject that because it clashes with my priors. So that is a very conservative mechanism because, it makes it hard for us to change our minds, but it also, kind of prevents any change that would be too strong. But then fortunately, we have other mechanisms such as reasoning and argumentation that allow us to overcome this initial negative reaction we have towards anything that challenges our beliefs. And then, then again, if you tell me that actually, you are talking about a green elephant that was just a balloon, and then I can be convinced that there is actually a green elephant in your bedroom.
What I find very interesting about this probability checking, so we check against our background beliefs, which implies basically that we are overly critical. So that is the conclusion that we can draw from this probability checking. So we always check, I have this new information, and does it cohere with what I already believe, what I already think is the case? So it seems to be to a certain extent in contradiction with critical thinking, you could say, where there's lots of ideas of saying, look, we have to make people more critical. But you seem to have another message in regards to that.
Yes, no, yeah, I think obviously the intentions of people who want to defend critical thinking are very noble, and most of the work they do is useful. But I think the emphasis on critical thinking is largely misplaced on the critical part anyway, because I think that the main problem we have as a society isn't that we accept too much bad information, but that we reject too much good information. And so what we should teach people isn't so much to be able to reject more information, to be more critical, to be more skeptical, but on the contrary, to learn who they can trust so that they can give more trust to scientists, give more trust to experts when it's warranted, give more trust to politicians even when it's warranted, give more trust to journalists on the whole. And that is what would probably be the most beneficial, rather than becoming even more critical of others.
But don't we then run the risk of being exploited, of being manipulated? Isn't it?
Yes, there's a trade-off. So
politicians, for instance.
Yes, no, we have to find the right trade-off. So that I don't suggest we would be uncritically accepting of whatever politicians tell us. But for instance, in most democracies in which people have looked at the data, politicians actually keep most of their promises. So when something is on a politician's platform, in most cases they will at least try to implement it. In many cases, they will actually manage to implement it. And so this idea we have that we can't believe anything politicians are saying, they're all lying anyway, is misguided. And that's a problem, because if we realize that actually most of the things they say they will implement, they will try at least to implement, then maybe we would pay more attention to their platforms, and we would be more careful in deciding who to vote for, instead of just having this kind of blanket rejection of all of them as being kind of liars and untrustworthy.
Yeah. So your message is there are good reasons to be more open for the information that we get from others, because the benefits are higher than when we are distrustful. So we talked about how to evaluate the content, but of course another way to see whether the information is reliable is to have a look at the source of the information. Who is giving us the information, and can we really trust that person? And how does that work according to you?
So when it comes to the source, I think there are two main elements we look for. One is the source right? So for instance, did you have special access to information? Did you see something? Or are you an expert in the relevant domain? Or are you just someone who is broadly competent in a given area? And so that just tells us whether you have the right belief or not. So that's obviously crucial, but it's not sufficient, because if you're right, but you don't tell me the truth, you don't tell me what you think is right, then it's gonna useless. And so the other element we look for is whether we believe that people who talk to us have our best interests at heart, whether you're a good friend, or just more generally someone who cares about me, someone who would hesitate to lie to me or to kind of jeopardize your reputation, because our interests are broadly aligned.
But it's not always easy, of course, to make those distinctions. For instance, when it's about a scientific issue, then there are lots of pseudoscientists or purveyors of pseudoscience that try to mimic or at least pretend to be scientific and to be an expert in the case. So for instance, in the case of evolutionary theory, you have evolutionary biologists, but especially in the United States, there are people who say evolutionary theory, it's wrong. We have creationism, and we have good reasons for that. And look, I have a PhD. I've written this book that is published with an acknowledged press. I use these big words. I use mathematics and formula and bibliography. So how can people then make the distinction? Huh?
Yes, no, it is very difficult. And if you're not one of the few experts in any given field, you have to rely on heuristics and rules of thumb to figure out who you can trust. And so to some extent, these heuristics can end up being relatively crude, like saying, well, or saying who has a PhD, if it's a PhD in the right domain, what kind of the prestige of the university they work at, or these sort of things. But these heuristics, however crude, are still better than nothing. Because essentially the main alternative is just to mistrust everyone, because you're not going to just trust everyone on every topic. That's just not really an option. And so it seems as if the two alternatives are either to use these heuristics to the best you can, as best you can, or just to have a blanket rejection of science, for instance, because you can't figure out who you can trust. So you just decide, I'm going to reject everything, which is arguably worse. One thing to keep in mind as well is that even though these heuristics are kind of crude, and sometimes we can get tricked by people who look as if they are experts, but who are not really, on the whole, things aren't working as badly as we might fear. And where it's kind of hard to gauge that is that I think we tend to forget that some ideas are more intuitive than others. And so in the case of evolution, for instance, it can be pretty well argued that creationism is a much more intuitive idea than evolution. If you ask children, or if you ask people in pre-scientific societies, whether species change over time, they will tell you that no. If you have babies, ducks are gonna black parents are gonna have baby ducks, etc., etc. And so the idea that species change over time is really counterintuitive, and there's a reason why it took so long for humans to discover it. And so, on the one hand, most people in most kind of Western kind of rich societies still have managed to accept evolution in spite of the fact that it is deeply counterintuitive. Whereas by contrast, when creationists manage to kind of convince people to accept creationism, in a way they are mostly reinforcing people's priors. And so there isn't that much conviction going on. And so even though it might look as if both kind of scientists and kind of pseudoscientists are managing to convince people to the same extent, I think because the priors are very really kind of supports the creationists rather than the evolutionists, in fact, the evolutionists are doing a much better job at convincing people, given the priors, than the pseudoscientists.
So this intuitive appeal, of course, explains quite a bit of phenomena then. For instance, that it takes much more work to explain to children, to educate them in evolutionary theory, whereas children of 5-year-olds get stories about creation and they just accept it very easily, and they think that this is the case, of course. Yes. So what I find very interesting about this is that you start from the idea that, look, we are critical about the information that comes in. So we're not gullible at all, but nevertheless, we observe that there are some pretty weird beliefs circling around. But then, of course, we have to explain why these weird beliefs are there, even though we tend to be very critical about the information. So it seems that ideas have to develop strategies, you could say, and they have to adapt to our vigilance. And it seems that they can only trick us under certain circumstances. So by adopting particular strategies. So one of them is the intuitive appeal that you talked about. So pseudoscientific beliefs or irrational beliefs, religious beliefs, they tap into our intuitions that we got from evolution. But are there other explanations available under which, or circumstances under which that we tend to be vulnerable to weird beliefs?
Yes, so there are many mechanisms that can be at play. One of them, and possibly the most important, is the one that you highlighted, which is that in some domains we just have completely kind of mistaken intuitions, because these mechanisms, these cognitive mechanisms, did not evolve to think about science or to elaborate more complex ideas. And so when we bring them to bear on issues, if you take someone who's never heard of science and they start thinking about, how astronomy works or how life works or how physics works, their ideas are going to be mistaken, and that makes sense. And then not only are they going to be mistaken, but they are going to be mistaken in a specific direction rather than just being kind of randomly mistaken. Another example that that brings me back to your initial question is vaccination. And unfortunately, there are good reasons to believe that vaccination is a relatively counterintuitive form of therapy, which you can try to get if you imagine that you don't know that vaccination works so well, and you're just told that we're going to take something, to make it very sketchy and simplified, but we're going to take something from someone who is sick and inject it into a perfectly a healthy baby, and that seems nuts. That seems like the worst possible thing you could do. And so that's why there has always been resistance to vaccination. In every country there is resistance to vaccination. So the one we see now in response to the COVID vaccine, and which is growing worryingly, these are not new. These are essentially, they're always there, and it's possible they'll always be there. And the contrast, then again, the contrast is quite striking with other forms of therapies that are not counterintuitive. So if you break a bone, setting the bone is going to be fairly intuitive. You just want to put the bone back in place, and in every culture, people accept that practice, and they have no problem with it. So I think that is the main mechanism: the fact that we can have wrong intuitions. Another mechanism for which kind of mistaken beliefs can spread is that we're careful, obviously, we really take into account whether a given belief is plausible or not, but we also take into account the costs of different mistakes. And sometimes accepting a belief that in fact is false is not such a big deal, whereas rejecting a belief that in fact would have been true would be a much bigger deal. And so that's one of the reasons maybe why some rumors, for instance, some false rumors spread. So if you hear a rumor, that there is someone is in a neighborhood who is to take an extreme example, like a pedophile or something, it might make sense, even if you're not convinced that is the case. It might make sense to entertain that belief, to keep it in mind, to be more careful, to warn other parents, even if you don't accept it. So there are beliefs that can spread even if people don't fully accept them, just because they're kind of interesting enough or kind of worrying enough that if they were true, we would really want to know. And then another mechanism that brings really counterintuitive conclusions is a mechanism that's called burning bridges. That in some cases, and somewhat counterintuitively, you really want to antagonize people. And the reason why you want to, one of the reasons anyway, why you might want to antagonize people is that by antagonizing some people, you can show other people that you would be a faithful member of their group. So for instance,
signal group membership.
Exactly. So in particular, if you want to show your allegiance to an extremist group, you want to show them that you would not be accepted in the main community. And so, to take an extreme example, if you want to be accepted by neo-Nazis, if you tattoo a swastika on your forehead, that's going to do the trick, because no one is going to want to talk to you, hire you, or do anything with you. And so then they realize that you don't have any choice but to be faithful to them, because you have burned all your other bridges.
You have the same idea about conspiracy, or about flat Earth theory as well. How does that work then?
Exactly. Yeah. So the idea is that tattooing a swastika on your forehead is a bit extreme, but there are other ways of burning bridges, and some of them are simply to hold or to profess extreme beliefs that most people would find either kind of stupid or morally offensive. And so it is possible, for instance, that flat earthers, so people who claim that the Earth is flat, and nowadays they say that it also has it's kind of surrounded by a giant wall of ice, because if you lay out a map of the Earth, you have the Antarctica around it. So that these people would use these extreme beliefs that indeed make them rejected by most of society as a way of creating a stronger community and of building stronger links with other people.
But does that mean, Hugo, that people do not really believe that, because they entertain these ideas for not epistemic reasons, so not to have knowledge about the world, but just to signal group membership? So it seems to suggest that that at least believers in flat Earth, that they do not really believe that, but that they just adopt this belief in order to say, look, I like your group and I want to belong to your group. I don't like mainstream ideas. I want to resist that. What do you think about that?
Yes, I think talking about really beliefs is really tricky, because if you ask them, they will tell you, no, I really believe the Earth is flat. So you have to, and they might not be, in most cases they wouldn't be consciously deceiving you. And so a useful way of, a useful way I think of looking at this is to abandon the idea that there's one category of beliefs, that either you believe something or you don't believe something, and that instead it is useful to distinguish within beliefs what I've called, kind of following Dan Sperber, intuitive beliefs and reflective beliefs. So intuitive beliefs are, sorry.
Yeah, could you explain that a little bit? Because I think for most people it will be
yes,
not easy, that distinction.
Indeed, it is. It is actually a very tricky one for everyone. It is not an intuitive distinction. So intuitive beliefs are the beliefs that we form in everyday life. So I see now, I can see you, so I know you're in your room. I can draw all sorts of inferences from that. I can see my surroundings. Or if you communicate to me some simple information about what books are on your bookshelf or something like this, I will just form a belief, and that belief that is intuitive, I will act accordingly. So I know where to reach you because I know you're in your home. I know that I can't just walk straight in front of me because there is a desk. All of these beliefs will inform my behavior. There's a very good match between what I believe when I believe it intuitively and how I act. By contrast, when it comes to reflective beliefs, these beliefs are essentially separated from the rest of cognition, and we don't really draw any inferences. We don't do much with them. We don't create new beliefs from them, and we don't really act according to them. So that doesn't mean that we don't, that we don't believe them. So, for instance, I really believe that relativity theory is, correct, approximately at least, and yet that doesn't do anything, that doesn't influence my behavior in any way. I'm completely unable to draw any inference from that. It's just there. But it doesn't mean that I don't really believe in relativity theory. It just believes that belief is largely inert. And I think that many of the false beliefs that we have are of that sort.
Okay, but does that mean that these false beliefs, that they are not as harmless as we tend to think, because we do not tend to act upon them, but we just hold them as reflective beliefs? We think that this is indeed what is going on, but we do not act upon them. So if that's the case for these false beliefs, maybe we could say, okay, people just don't act upon them. They don't believe them to the extent that they will act upon them. So maybe they're more harmless than we tend to think.
Yes. No, essentially, I think it is largely true. So we tend to focus on the cases in which there seems to be a match between people's false beliefs and their actions. So the example I take in the book, and it's quite a striking one, is that of Edgar Madison Welch, who is this guy who used his assault weapon to storm the pizzeria in Washington, D.C., in which children were supposed to be abused by Democrats. So there was, the so-called Pizzagate, these widely spread conspiracy theories according to which high-level Democrats were abusing children in the basement of that pizzeria. And so that guy took his gun, he drove several hundred miles, and he stormed the pizzeria and actually fired a shot and asked that the children be freed. And so that is this kind of people who make us think, well, people who believe these conspiracy theories are completely nuts and it's really serious. What we don't see is the other millions, presumably, of Americans who say they believe in Pizzagate in some way, and yet do nothing about it. Or for quite a few of them, they left one-star reviews on the pizzeria's website. So I think it's just, we forget how...
It's not a proper response to the kind of...
Exactly, how incongruous it is. Like, imagine, because it's hard for us to really believe, but imagine you had like really hard proof that children were being abused somewhere. Like, you've seen pictures or something horrible. And your reaction is to leave a one-star review saying, well, the pizza is undercooked and I think children are being abused. There are people who left reviews like that, which is just so insane. But, it is, by contrast, Edgar Welch's behavior of, taking his gun and trying to free the children is actually the rational thing to do. If you actually have an intuitive belief that children are being abused and that, the cops are corrupt, so you can't just have, call the authorities, then the right thing to do, the moral thing to do is to do what he did. And the fact that he was the only one to do it and that no one else essentially did anything of any meaning suggests that he was the only one to maybe have an intuitive belief that Pizzagate was correct.
Yeah. Now, of course, these beliefs tend to be harmless to the extent that they do not elicit any action. But there are some beliefs, or quite a few beliefs, that do seem to have very bad or negative effects. Think, for instance, beliefs about Jewish conspiracies, for instance, that seem to inspire pogroms and the persecution of Jews, especially during Nazism. And also we tend to think that this is the result of Nazi propaganda to a large extent, where people were convinced, look, the Jews, we cannot trust them, so we have to clear the society of these so-called parasites. So it seems that there it's not really reflective belief, and that indeed people have been convinced of these beliefs. What do you have to say about what do you say about that? Because here there seems to be a clear case where people are gullible and are influenced by these people.
Yes, no, thank you for the question, Stefan. So I think that, so it's good to look at two cases separately: the case of the pogroms and the case of the propaganda in Nazi Germany. So there's actually quite a lot of work now, of good quantitative work on the effect of Nazi propaganda. And it seems pretty clear that the effects were pretty small. And that in most cases, Nazi propaganda just completely failed to have any effect on the population. And then in the case of anti-Semitism, it worked a little bit, and only on the areas that were already very highly anti-Semitic. So what seems to have happened is that the propaganda essentially gave cover to people who were already very anti-Semitic to act on the basis of that anti-Semitism, because it showed that the government would have their back, or the government would not prosecute them or attack them in any way.
So it provided an
support them.
excuse. It provided an excuse, you could say.
Yes, it's even more than an excuse, because it shows them that they can't fear any material. They're not going to be prosecuted. They're not going to be they're not going to suffer any consequences for their actions. And for instance, like if you want to predict where there was more actions taken against Jews by citizens, not by the regime, but by citizens, like denunciations to the Nazi newspapers, or kind of local actions by citizens against Jews, you're actually better off not looking at where there was more Nazi propaganda, but by looking at where there had been more pogroms in the 14th century. And so there are, it seems, structural factors that mean that given how populations mix, and given the incentives of people, and given all sorts of kind of economic and demographic factors, there will be anti-Semitism to different degrees, or other types of vilification of minorities, and that Nazi propaganda didn't convince anybody really, or very few people, to become more anti-Semitic. It just kind of gave cover to people who already were.
So your argument is basically that the causality works the other way around. So that it's not propaganda that caused the anti-Semitism, but it was the other way around, namely that in certain regions you find strong anti-Semitic feelings, and that this made people, of course, receptive for the propaganda, which this is of course a completely different message that we tend to hear, namely that the whole propaganda machine of the Nazis, invented by Goebbels, that it influenced the German population. So what you mean is also that large parts of the German population were not receptive to the propaganda at all.
No, indeed. I mean, so not only was not only the whole German population not receptive at all to some aspects of Nazi propaganda. So, for instance, they had a campaign to try to get people to accept widespread euthanasia of the handicapped, and it had no success whatsoever. There were several campaigns, or after Stalingrad, they wanted to sell the idea that they were still winning the war, and no one was buying it whatsoever. So most propaganda efforts by the Nazi just failed. And in the case of propaganda related to anti-Semitism, what the data suggests, as you are saying, is that it actually potentially backfired and led to more distrust of the regime in the areas that were the least anti-Semitic. And indeed, as a point of detail, actually, when Hitler was a political candidate before he had taken power, he did not mention anti-Semitism much. Like, he was really run on a platform of mostly of anti-communism, because he knew that it was much more popular than anti-Semitism. So it only once he took power that became a big thing.
So basically, the Nazis were just very clever in tapping into the right sort of sentiments that were already.
Yes, I mean, sometimes they failed. I mean, they failed in a number of cases, but yeah, the way Hitler is often described by people who've looked at him closely is just he was a brilliant demagogue. Not in the sense that he was great at influencing crowds, but in the sense that he was great at feeling them and at understanding what they wanted to hear, and at getting people to like him. Not by kind of brainwashing them or anything, but just by telling them what they wanted to hear, and by representing, unfortunately, some of their opinions.
So probably to a large extent, the same applies to Donald Trump, and that he says the things that the Americans, or at least a large part of the American population, likes to hear.
Yes, that's what demagogues are good at, and indeed, to some extent, he is good at that. And I think we can see that in the recent allegations of voter fraud. Because it's easy to, so there has been a number of polls now, some of them being more or less optimistic about whether Americans are accepting Biden as president. I mean, obviously Democrats are accepting him as president, or as president-elect. Among Republicans, things are more complicated, and many Republicans are saying that the elections weren't free and fair. There are many reasons why they actually were unfair, but that's not reasons they have in mind. And so it's tempting to think, well, they believe that, even though it's completely false and there's no, voter fraud or anything like that to speak of. It's tempting to think that these people have, these mistaken beliefs because of all the misinformation surrounding voter frauds, these false allegations that circulated. But in fact, once again, as you are saying, the causality is broadly the other way around. it is because many people want to believe that Trump won, or that there are reasons why his defeat can be disputed. And then they become receptive, or they become not so much receptive as eager to have information that would confirm these beliefs. So that would allow them to defend their view in public. And we can see that, for instance, because 4 years ago, already many, in that case, many Democrats, because they're the ones who lost, many Democrats thought the election wasn't free and fair, fewer than those who believe that, fewer than the Republicans who believe it wasn't free and fair now. But essentially, there's growing affective polarization in the US, and people are increasingly inclined to believe that the other side, engaged in all sorts of shenanigans. And we're not seeing anything particularly out of range, given the way things are evolving this time around. I mean, this is a very worrying trend, but it's unlikely that misinformation per se plays a large role in it.
Mm-hmm. But it does, of course, nuance the idea that the adherents of Trump, that they are blind followers. It seems that they are consumers of information, and that they do that in a strategic way, and so that it suits their purposes, which is also an idea that I find very interesting, that people can adopt ideas and beliefs or claim things because it suits their purposes.
Yes. So, no, completely, yeah. So just one thing, just to not to not say that people like Trump are innocuous, is that even if they're only or mostly kind of giving voice to people, unfortunately, to people's racist views or other views, they still allow them to have more political power because they make it clear that so many people share these views, and so, which is in other contexts it's a very good thing, obviously, and it's there's nothing intrinsically bad about that, except that in some cases it would be better if it was harder for coalitions to build around these kind of opinions.
We've been talking about propaganda, which is of course a strong attempt to influence people, but there seem to be other, perhaps more hidden forms of manipulation, such as, for instance, the use of Facebook campaigns in political, in times of elections, but also, for instance, advertisements. And still, you argue that despite the big claims that are being made or have been made about these kind of influences, that the effect are very little. Could you say a few words about that?
Yes. So in there, I'm just purely relying on the literature on advertising research and political science, which shows that the effects of political campaigns, whether they use robocalling or online ads, TV ads, canvassing, anything, or the effects of advertising, then again, either online or on TV or anything, are very small. In many cases, there are no effects whatsoever. So many advertising campaigns just don't seem to make any difference.
Which is very strange, because it seems to involve millions of money are being made on the idea that people can be influenced on advertising.
Yes. So the thing is, sometimes small effects are enough. So there's an asymmetry in that. If you run huge political campaign or a huge advertising campaign, and millions of people are going to see your ads, sometimes even if you convince like 1,000 of them, it might be enough to sell enough products or to win an election. And so even if from the point of view of the population, like the effect is absolutely tiny, from the point of view of the companies or the political campaigners, it might be sufficient to warrant the expense. It is also possible that indeed a lot of money is wasted. A lot of money is wasted by poorly done advertising, or by just advertising that has no chance to work, by political campaign tactics that have no chance to work. It's hard to do these things well. It's hard to know when it works or not. For instance, there was a lovely study by people at Google and Microsoft showing that to know whether an online ad actually brings a positive return on investment, you need so many millions of data points that it's, most people can't tell. And so we assume that, these people, and they are they are very smart, etc. But even doing the best they can, it is really hard for them to know whether any campaign is actually working or not.
Yeah. And does that also mean, for instance, a couple of years ago, there was this huge row about Cambridge Analytics, for instance, that it was overstated, that this was an overreaction?
Overstated is an understatement, yeah. Yeah, there's no evidence whatsoever that anything they did had any effect, and it's now pretty consensually recognized that it was a scam. So if anybody had been gullible, it was the political operatives who bought their services. In that they were not doing anything of value. So they're trying to do political targeting, so trying to get information on people's values or personality, and then to target political advertising based on these traits. So if you're introverted, I'm going to give you an ad. If you're extroverted, I'm going to give you another ad. And first of all, there's very little evidence that this increases the effect of ads. The effects of ads are very, very small to start with. At best, you would increase them very little bit. And that's only based on targeting that we have good reason to know works. And in the case of political targeting, we have no reason whatsoever to believe they had no idea what they were doing.
Right. So another thing that you talked about, and which I also find very interesting, is this. And now we go a little bit back into time, is to the Middle Ages, and in the context of religion. And so we've now been talking about advertisement, politics, but also in religion. And there is this idea that in the Middle Ages, the whole of Europe was converted to Christianity, so that there was some very effective messaging, some very effective spreading of the message. But nevertheless, you argue that this was not the case, that we should be very skeptical about this claim that there was like this dark Middle Ages where everyone was converted to Christianity. And so I thought that was really, really fascinating.
So first of all, there's one thing people have to let go of, the idea of kind of mass conversion, because it goes, if you look at, like, let's say the way Christianity spread under the Romans, you go from one person essentially to having like half of the Roman Empire being nominally Christians in a couple of hundred years. But actually, it looks as if this is an explosion. But in fact, it's enough that each person convinces one person in their lifetime. And essentially, you get this kind of what looks like a huge movement, but in fact is extremely slow. And that's what you find, like in all studies of more recent religions for which we have better data. Even for the most successful religions, the rate of growth is actually very, very, very slow. But with kind of compound interest, you can get huge results. If you consistently growing 1% every year, you're going to become huge. But you're still growing only 1% every year. And then the other thing is that, as all kind of anthropologists know, in most cultures, when you have a dominant kind of dogmatic religion, most people disregard the vast majority of the dogma. And so they will be nominally Christian, for instance, in that case, and so many of them will get married and there'll be a priest there, or maybe their kids are going to get baptized, but otherwise, they will be nearly entirely pagan in their practices. So they're going to keep, believing in witches. They're going to believe in saints, which are not, exactly kind of standard Christianity at the beginning. They will, engage in all sorts of magic, and they will refuse to do anything that the church, asks that they don't want to do in the first place. So, when it comes to, to go to confession, to do penance, to do anything like this,
it's against their interest.
Exactly, yeah. So there's in the book I said this fantastic reports from Humbert de Romans, who is the Dominican preacher who would go on to become a pope. So someone pretty good in 12th century France, and he just despairs of his flock. Like they come to church, but they don't care at all. They just chat with each other, and when they go on pilgrimages, they're actually just essentially going whoring and getting drunk. And it's just like he can't, they don't know any prayers, they know nothing. It's like they all, the kind of the first-hand reports are like just it's God, they're just, these people are hopeless. So it is indeed very, very different from the image we might have of the kind of faithful, obedient, Christian.
So again, here we're confronted with the distinction, of course, between reflective beliefs and intuitive beliefs. So direct or not, or is that not the case?
Yes, no, it is. So many of these people would have. Nominally, they would say, no, sure, I believe in God and everything, but then again, none of their behavior would jive with that belief, yeah.
Doesn't affect them, yeah. Okay, Hugo, I see it's 9:30. And I already saw quite a few questions pop up. So I think it might be a good idea to end the interview here and then give the last quarter to the audience to give them the questions to you. Okay.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Stefaan. That was great.
All right, good. Make it go. So I'm not sure who is going to arrange the questions. Okay. Jasmine, are you going to ask the questions? No, Jasmine.
She can't unmute herself.
Here I am.
Okay.
I couldn't unmute myself.
Okay, sorry.
Very much, both of you. Was really interesting, and I see in the chat box that a lot of people have gone through it. So I try to distinguish a bit the same questions for things. Okay, so Hugo, I'll ask the question directly to you from the audience. But Stefaan, thank you a lot for the interview.
You're welcome.
I'll take over from now.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so Hugo, the first question from Helene is, she asked, what's the difference between actions following intuitive beliefs and actions caused by lack of control?
I'm not sure. So I don't know exactly. Does that, you have like an example, a more specific example in mind? Like sometimes I guess you can act even if you don't, you can act in a way that is so kind of impulsive that it doesn't really require any belief to speak of. So maybe that's the difference.
Okay, thank you, Helene. If you're okay with this answer, you can just say so. Otherwise, we go on. Other people also went more into the advertising parts, which I thought for myself was also very interesting. So yeah, a lot of studies make the mistake to measure the effects of individual advertisements, but the power of advertising lies in repetition and recognition. Someone also said, like, marketing theory says a potential client needs to see your material at least 7 times before considering becoming a client. Have the studies on Cambridge Analytica researched also effects over time?
So essentially, the main effect over time you get is that it's not so much the advertising itself as the product. So as is kind of mentioned in the question, people will if your advertising is a bit successful and you manage to put your product out there, people will start buying it. And then when they buy it, the advertising becomes irrelevant, essentially. So what the studies suggest is that people who have personal experience of a product, then advertising isn't going to make them buy more or less of it. It's just once you know something, then you rely entirely on your own experience rather than on what advertisers might try to tell you. And that's what matters the most, is that once you build a brand, what makes it successful in the long term is that you keep putting out good products that people enjoy, and instead of just constant advertising. So I mean, because we tend to think of these brands are successful and they do a lot of advertising, like Nike or Coca-Cola, but whenever they try to actually change their product, like Coke at some point, there was a complete disaster, even if there had been a huge advertising campaign. And we can also think of many brands that are extremely successful because they put out arguably very good products while doing very little advertising, from Google to some extent Apple or Amazon. And just they work, they broadly put out good products and people keep buying them even though they have no advertising. It suggests, or very little. So it suggests that it's just seeing that a brand is successful and that it advertises doesn't mean that the advertising is causing the success.
Okay. That's very interesting. So yeah, that's about advertising and campaigns, but are you also critical of things like nudging and framing? Or someone talks about message carpet bombing. I have personally no idea what that is, but it's Kahneman's ID, for instance?
So carpet bombing, I guess, is just when you do it a lot, like when you just you know, like you're kind of a political campaign, you're gonna call people and put ad on TV, put ads online and call them and go to their places and put posters and everything. Then again, I mean, the evidence suggests that that it doesn't work particularly, or it doesn't work better, and that there is no strong effect of repetition. Like just once you've gotten the information. So to the extent that political campaigning, for instance, works, it is by making people aware of politicians' positions. And then if the position that the politician defends happens to fit with the people's views, then they might shift towards that politician. So it's conviction to the extent that people are changing their minds, but it's conviction based on the fact that the politician is representing what the people want. And so once you've done that, then telling people 5,000 times that that person is pro-life or pro-choice, it's not going to make a difference. You're going to go with them or against them based on whether you're pro-choice or pro-life. But just repetition isn't going to do anything.
Okay, thank you for this. And how would you explain then the process of, for instance, radicalization? Is somebody asking?
Well, I'm not exactly an expert in that, but I think the main theories out there suggest that the most potent driver of radicalization is a lack of status, or it's not obviously, or like a gap between the status people believe they deserve and the status they are given by society. And so obviously most people who feel a bit, they feel as if they're being rejected, or they feel as if they're being treated unfairly, or they feel as if they should have a better status in society than they do, don't end up radicalizing. But it seems as if it is, very few people who have a good status, do radicalize. So it seems to be a necessary condition, even if not sufficient. And then once you have, because of that low status and maybe other factors, you have, you don't feel as if you really belong in society. The way in which you will deal with that will be influenced by the alternatives that are out there. And so if there is indeed a terrorist group that that seems like an appealing alternative, that suggests another way for you to gain status, that suggests something you can do, then you might turn to that. Maybe at another time you would have turned towards political extremes or some other type of organization. So what's out there will play a role. So it might convince you to go towards one extreme organization rather than another. But that willingness, that tendency to go towards such organizations in the first place, they don't create. It's there first in some people.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Okay. A last question, I think, unless everybody found his way to the chat box, but a final question now. Someone asked if we could use social media to converse people to the urge of climate change. Or how do you think, what do you think is a way that would be more efficient? Joris suggests making it cool.
Yes, no, that's a good question. So we know that there are several messaging strategies that can have small effects, at least when it comes to climate change, such as telling people that there's a scientific consensus, alerting them to that fact. So although, to be fair, in most, at least in most Western countries, even in the US, most people now accept the reality of climate change. And I think also majorities, even in the US, accept the fact that it's man-made. So, it doesn't mean that you don't want to keep converting those who resist that, but we've mostly, passed that thing. What I guess you need to convert people to, or to change their minds, is what can be done. What are the most efficient policies, that they should support a carbon tax, they should stop eating meat, they should buy an electric car, whatever is the best thing to do. And there are reasons to believe that social media can be an effective way of doing that, not by having kind of advertising on social media or kind of mass campaigns necessarily, but because just they allow people to talk to each other. And we know that people are vastly more likely to be convinced by a friend than by some kind of advertising they see coming from someone they don't know, because they can trust a friend. Maybe they know that that person is knowledgeable in the relevant area. They have time to exchange arguments. And so in these contexts, people can really affect a lot of change. They really, and I think most of us have hopefully seen that. We've had that experience of someone else changing our mind on something, or we change someone else's mind. It happens more often than we might think.
Okay, more on social media. Like nowadays, social media is actively taking action against misinformation. For example, about COVID's, Florence says, but also about the presidential elections in the US. Do you think that's a good thing that they're like actively taking action, or do you think it's working counterproductive?
Well, I don't have a strong opinion. I don't think that the misinformation was as huge a problem as it is often portrayed to be in the first place. So for instance, there has been now lots of studies of fake news on Twitter or Facebook. And it turns out that usually, in fact, on both platforms, something like 80% at least of the users have never seen a single piece of fake news. That most, the vast majority of the fake news that is shared and seen by a very, very small minority of the people who don't seem to care so much about anything. So it doesn't mean that it's it's not ideal, but it's not great. But it doesn't mean that it's great. But the problem is much more circumscribed than we might think it is. So but still, I mean, if they can do something about it, why not? As to the possibility that it might backfire, either by making people say, well, look, we're being censored and it's horrible, or by them, for instance, stopping actually good information. I think it's also possible, but I don't think it's necessarily a huge issue. So for instance, like in the US, Facebook had forbidden, I don't know the exact details, but essentially forbidden political ads in the last week before the election, or new political ads anyway. And it seemed like, it's like a worthwhile, thing, but in fact, you're also depriving political parties of one way of communicating with citizens. So if, for instance, Trump through Twitter, puts out some false information, then the Democrats don't have really the means to address that through advertising, which is, it's not clear. It's better than the alternative. So it's, yeah, I don't think either is going to make much of a difference, but yeah.
Okay, and someone is going further into this. Do you think that the remedy of disinformation is not censorship, but actually more information?
Yes, exactly, yeah. Because censorship, first of all, it's not going to work to a large extent because people will turn to other channels. So now we see that misinformation may be spreading on WhatsApp or just mouth-to-mouth, face-to-face communication, word of mouth, sorry. With the way it always had before social media, so it might be a bit slower, but it's gonna get there anyway. And so indeed, what we need is more and better information, and we need people to trust that, because in all of these cases of misinformation, the correct information is out there, and most of the people who accept the false information are aware that the correct information exists, and they reject it. And so the issue is why do they reject it? Why are they being too vigilant and too conservative and too sticking to their beliefs? And that's what we have to work on to get them to trust more mainstream media, to trust more official sources.
Okay, and do you think that our mechanisms of vigilance are easy to bypass by nudging tricks? So this is a question from someone about...
That's a good question. So I don't think they are. And indeed, many at least nudging tricks work because of thanks to these epistemic vigilance or open vigilance mechanisms. So for instance, one of the tricks that people who do nudging use quite a bit is to change default options. And so, for instance, there was one of the best known example is if when you register for your driver's license, the default option is that you become an organ donor then most people are going to become an organ donor because they don't bother changing to actually, no, I actually don't want to give my organs. Whereas if the default option is to not give your organs, few people bother changing that as well. But the reason why we trust the default option is that we can implicitly trust the organism that puts that as a default. And if over time we realize that they are putting defaults that are actually really bad for us, we're going to stop trusting them and we're going to be more careful. So you can see that on websites because many websites, when you have to click, if you're not careful, you're going to either stay clicked or unclick the thing that means that they're going to submerge you with a bunch of emails. And I think most of us have learned that, and now we're careful. Okay, am I really clicking that I don't want to receive all the emails? Because we know we can't trust them. So all of that works, and you can trick people, but only in the short term, and then they learn and you can't trick them anymore.
Okay, and then a final question, because we're 9:45. Isn't misinformation also not linked to a culture of post-truth and cynicism? Isn't that culture not a danger rather?
I don't think so. Partly because there has always been misinformation, there has always been fake news and false rumors and things like that. So I think the two are largely unrelated phenomena. It's not even clear that there's more misinformation now compared to, arguably actually you could make quite easily the case that the ratio of correct to incorrect information is higher than it's ever been. You have things like Wikipedia, and just it's just insane, all the correct information that's out there. So in absolute terms, probably there is more misinformation just because there is so much information. But in relative terms, I think it's probably things have improved. And I think that whatever misinformation we see now, its spread is completely unrelated to the fact that in some intellectual circles you have or you had to some extent a fashion for extreme postmodernist positions. Like typically, the people who are extreme Foucauldian or extreme postmodernist in universities are not the ones that are going to fall for fake news on Facebook or something. Okay,
well, Hugo Mercier, thank you very much for your lecture and for answering all of the extra questions.
Thank you so much, Jasmine.
Thank you. Oké, iedereen. Fijn dat jullie er nog allemaal zijn vanavond. Hopelijk vinden jullie het nog heel gezellig. We gaan nu weer een klein kwartiertje pauze houden. En dan zie ik jullie allemaal graag terug om 10:00 stipt. Want dan hebben we Kate Kirkpatrick bij ons. En zij wordt geïnterviewd door Evelien Groot. Maar meer daarover straks om 10:00. Dan zal ik nu nog een streepje muziek terugzetten. Hè? Tot straks iedereen.